The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a pale glow on the wooden floors of the quiet house. Michael Harper sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the cup of coffee in his hands. The steam had long since faded, leaving the liquid cold untouched. He couldn't hear the faint hum of the refrigerator or the birds chirping outside the window, but he could feel the vibrations of his own heartbeat in his chest, slow and heavy. His eyes, dull and distant, flicked toward the ceiling as a soft tremor passed through the floor. He recognized the familiar sensation his daughter, Grace, was awake. Her small footsteps moved lightly across the upstairs hallway, likely headed toward the piano room as they did every morning. Michael closed his eyes, feeling the weight of guilt settle deeper into his bones. Grace was growing up so fast, and yet he remained a distant figure in her life, a shadow of the man he once was. It had been years since the accident, years since the world had gone silent for him. Once, music had been his lifeblood. His fingers had danced across piano keys, and the world had vibrated with melodies that only he could create. But now, those days felt like a distant memory, buried beneath the crushing silence that defined his existence. He had shut himself away from everything and everyone, including Grace. The sound of her playing drifted into his thoughts, not through his ears, but through the faint reverberations in the floor. She was probably sitting at the old piano right now, her small hands moving hesitantly over the keys, practicing the simple melody she'd been working on for weeks. She had a natural talent, one he had noticed early on. But he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge it, couldn't face the music literally or metaphorically. Pushing the cold cup of coffee aside, Michael stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked toward the stairs, his steps heavy against the wooden floor. With each step, he felt the slight tremor beneath his feet as Grace continued to play, unaware of his approach. He paused at the top of the stairs, his gaze landing on the slightly ajar door to the piano room. The note she played was soft, barely enough to be felt through the vibrations, but they stirred something in him, a memory of what once was, and a reminder of what he had lost. Michael leaned against the doorframe, watching Grace from a distance. Her back was to him, her auburn hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. She was hunched slightly over the piano, her fingers carefully pressing the keys. She glanced over her shoulder and saw him standing there. For a moment, their eyes met, but then Grace quickly turned back to the piano, her fingers faltering on the keys. The silence between them was thick, more deafening than any sound could have been. Michael's chest tightened as he watched her, knowing she longed for some connection, some acknowledgement from him. But he couldn't do it. He couldn't find the words or the strength to cross the emotional chasm that had formed between them. Without a word, he turned and left the room, his footsteps heavy as he walked back downstairs. He could feel Grace's disappointment lingering in the air, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He retreated to his office, a small room filled with remnants of a life he no longer lived. The walls were lined with sheet music, compositions he had written before the accident. They were yellowed with age, untouched for years. Michael sat at his desk, his hands resting on the old sheet music. His fingers traced the notes, remembering how they had once flowed effortlessly from his mind to the piano. Now, they were nothing more than ghostly imprints of a time when music had been his whole world. He crumpled one of the sheets in his fist, a surge of frustration rising within him, but he stopped short of tearing it completely. There was still something there, a faint connection to the music, even if it was buried beneath layers of pain. As he sat there, lost in thought, the faint vibrations of Grace's playing reached him again. This time, something inside him stirred, a flicker of curiosity rather than the usual bitterness. He could sense her determination in the way she pressed the keys, the way the vibrations traveled through the floor. She was trying so hard to reach him, to find some way to connect with him through the only thing they shared, music. Later that afternoon, Grace convinced him to take her to the park, something they hadn't done in months. The walk was quiet, strained, as it always was between them. Grace hummed softly as they walked, her eyes occasionally glancing up at him, hoping for some response. Michael noticed her lips moving, but of course, he heard nothing. Still, the sight of her humming reminded him of the days when music had flowed freely between them, before everything had changed. They stopped by the pond, Grace's eyes scanning the water as she continued to hum her melody. Michael watched her for a moment, a strange sensation creeping over him. She was trying to reach him, not with words, but with the silent language of music. It was a language they both understood, even if he could no longer hear it. That evening, Michael found Grace in the living room, her small fingers tracing the notes on one of his old sheet music books. She looked up at him, startled, quickly closing the book as if she had been caught doing something wrong. But Michael didn't feel anger. Instead, he felt a pang of sadness and, for the first time in years, a desire to bridge the gap between them. Without saying a word, he walked over and sat beside her. Grace hesitated, her fingers hovering over the pages, unsure of what to do next. Slowly, she opened the book again, her eyes flicking between the notes and her father's face. Michael didn't speak, but his presence was enough. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like the closest they had been in years. The silence between them was filled with unspoken words, but there was something else there to hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was enough to start rebuilding the bond they had lost. And as they sat together in the quiet of the living room, the unplayed music between them felt like a promised one that, with time, they might find a way to fulfill. Grace's curiosity had begun to grow in recent months. The more time she spent with the piano, the more questions surfaced about her father's life before the silence had taken hold of their home. She had heard stories from her mother, bits and pieces about Michael's career, his genius at the piano, and how he had captivated audiences around the world. But those stories seemed distant and unreal, like they belonged to a man she had never met. Sitting in the sunlit corner of the piano room, Grace flipped through one of the old music books she had found tucked away in the bookshelf. The pages were worn, and many of them had Michael's handwriting scrawled across the margins. She traced her finger along the notes, trying to imagine the melodies her father had once played. It was hard to picture him as the vibrant, creative person her mother had described. All Grace had ever known was the quiet, withdrawn man who barely spoke and rarely smiled. As she stared at the pages, she made up her mind. She needed to know more about the father she had never really known. Setting the book aside, Grace stood and quietly made her way downstairs. She found her mother, Anna, in the kitchen, sipping a cup of tea as she looked out the window. "Emma?" Grace asked softly, hesitating at the doorway. Anna turned, a gentle smile spreading across her face. "Yes, sweetheart. Can you tell me more about Dad? About before?" Grace's voice was barely above a whisper, as though speaking the words out loud might shatter the fragile peace in their home. Anna's smile faltered for a moment, her eyes clouding with a mix of sadness and nostalgia. She set down her cup and motioned for Grace to sit at the table with her. "Your dad. He was extraordinary," Anna began. her voice soft and reflective. He could make music come alive in a way that no one else could. People said he was one of the best pianists they had ever seen. When he played, it was like he was telling a story with every note. Grace leaned forward, hanging on her mother's every word. "What happened?" she asked, her brow furrowing. She knew about the accident, knew that her father had lost his hearing, but she had never understood how it had changed him so completely. Anna sighed, her eyes drifting toward the window as if she could still see the man Michael had once been. When the accident happened, it took more than just his hearing. It took his spirit. He was devastated, Grace. He felt like he lost the one thing that made him who he was. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. After that, he shut himself away from everything, even you. Grace's heart ached at the words, but she didn't look away. She needed to understand. Does he still love music? She asked, her voice barely audible. I think he does, somewhere deep down. But it's hard for him to face it. It reminds him of everything he's lost, Anna said, reaching out to squeeze Grace's hand. But you have a gift, Grace. I see it every time you play. And I think, maybe, if you keep playing, you might be able to help him find his way back. Grace nodded, her determination growing. She wanted to believe that her playing could reach him, that she could bridge the gap between them. But it wasn't just about the music. It was about the connection she longed to have with her father, a connection that had always seemed just out of reach. Over the next few days, Grace spent more time at the piano, her fingers growing more confident with each passing hour. She practiced the melodies she had found in her father's old music books, hoping that one day he would listen not just with his ears, but with his heart. Michael, meanwhile, noticed Grace's increasing dedication. He would pass by the piano room and see her hunched over the keys, her fingers moving gracefully across the ivory, her face a mask of concentration. It stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. But every time he thought about stepping into the room, about sitting beside her, the familiar pang of grief would tighten in his chest, and he would turn away. He feared that getting too close would only bring more pain for both of them. It was easier to keep his distance, to stay in the silence where nothing could hurt him. But even as he tried to shut out the world, he couldn't ignore the quiet determination in Grace's eyes. One evening, as Grace practiced, Michael found himself standing outside the door to the piano room once again. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her fingers move over the keys, the melody soft and tentative. For the first time, he noticed something different. Grace wasn't just playing notes, she was playing with emotion, with a depth that reminded him of how he used to play. Without thinking, Michael stepped into the room. Grace's fingers stilled as she looked up at him, surprise flickering across her face. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say or do, but then, slowly, he walked over to the piano and sat beside her. Grace's heart raced, her fingers trembling slightly as she looked at her father. She had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was happening, she didn't know what to say. For a few moments, they sat in silence, the unspoken weight of years pressing down on them. Finally, Grace spoke. "Will you help me? I want to learn, like you." Michael's breath caught in his throat. He had spent so long running from music, from the part of himself that had been lost, that the thought of teaching Grace felt both terrifying and inevitable. He looked down at her small hands, her fingers still resting on the keys. She had talent, that much was clear. But more than that, she had the same passion for music that he had once had. After what felt like an eternity, Michael nodded. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I'll help you." Gracie's face lit up with a smile, her eyes shining with hope. She turned back to the piano, her fingers trembling with excitement as they hovered over the keys. Michael placed his hands beside hers, guiding her through the first few notes of a simple melody. It was awkward at first, the silence between them still heavy, but as they played together, something began to shift. For the first time in years, Michael felt a flicker of the connection he had lost. Not just to the music, but to his daughter. The melody they played was simple, but in that moment, it was everything. As the evening wore on, they continued to play, the silence between them slowly giving way to something new, a tentative bond, fragile but real. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, Michael allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, music could heal more than just the silence. The following morning, the house was once again filled with the gentle vibrations of Gracie's playing. Michael stood at the top of the stairs, his hand resting on the railing as he listened not with his ears, but with his heart. The melody Grace played was one he recognized, a simple composition he had written many years ago. He hadn't taught it to her, yet somehow, she had found it in his old music books and had brought it to life again. There was a time when Michael could have played that melody without thinking, his fingers moving effortlessly over the keys, each note flowing into the next like water. But now, as he stood there, watching his daughter, he felt a deep pang of loss. Not just for the music, but for the time that had slipped away, the years he had spent locked in silence, distant from the people who mattered most. He knew Grace was trying to reach him through the music, and in his heart, he wanted to let her. But the fear of opening himself up again, of feeling that same crushing loss, held him back. He couldn't bear the thought of letting her down, of not being the father she deserved. Grace, unaware of his inner turmoil, continued to play, her small fingers moving gracefully over the keys. She glanced up briefly and saw him standing there. A shy smile crossed her face, and she kept playing, hoping that today he might join her. Michael hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked toward her. He sat down beside her on the piano bench, his presence a quiet acknowledgement that he was ready to try. Grace's heart soared, though she kept her focus on the music, her fingers steady as she played through the melody. When the final note lingered in the air, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with hope. Michael nodded slightly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't much, but it was more than he had offered in years. That was beautiful, he said quietly, his voice a little rough from disuse. Grace beamed, her heart swelling with pride. It's one of your pieces, isn't it? I found it in your old books. Michael's gaze drifted to the stack of sheet music beside the piano. It had been so long since he had even looked at those compositions, and seeing them now, in Grace's hands, stirred something deep within him. Yeah, he said after a moment, his voice soft. I wrote that. A long time ago. Grace hesitated, sensing the heaviness in his words. She wanted to ask him more, to learn about the man he had been before the silence took over their lives, but she didn't want to push too hard. Instead, she asked, "Will you teach me?" Michael's breath caught in his throat. Teaching her meant opening the door to everything he had tried so hard to shut out. It meant facing the music again, confronting the loss that had haunted him for so long. But as he looked into Grace's eyes, filled with so much hope and love, he realized he couldn't say no. She deserved more than the silence he had given her. All right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll teach you. Gracie's face lit up with joy, and for the first time in years, Michael felt a spark of something he thought he had last forever hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there, flickering in the quiet space between them. Over the next few weeks, they spent more time at the piano, their hands moving over the keys in unison, their connection slowly rebuilding through the shared language of music. At first, the lessons were awkward, filled with long stretches of silence as Michael struggled to find his rhythm, both as a teacher and as a father. But Grace's enthusiasm never wavered, and slowly, Michael found himself drawn back into the world he had left behind. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Michael sat alone in his office, staring at the sheet music scattered across his desk. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the notes on the page, memories of his old life flooding back in waves. He could almost hear the music in his head, though it was faint, like a distant echo. But instead of feeling the usual bitterness, something else stirred within him, a faint glimmer of possibility. He hadn't touched the piano in years, hadn't even considered the idea of playing again. But watching Grace, seeing the way the music came alive in her hands, had reignited something deep inside him. It wasn't just the love of music, it was the connection it created, the way it brought people together, even in the silence. The next morning, Michael found Grace in the piano room as usual. She was practicing one of his old compositions, her face scrunched up in concentration as she worked through a particularly difficult passage. Michael watched her for a moment, then walked over and sat beside her. "You're doing great," he said, surprising himself with how easily the words came out. "But here, let me show you something." Grace's eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly scooted over to make room for him on the bench. Michael placed his hands on the keys, the familiar sensation of the ivory under his fingers sending a wave of nostalgia through him. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure if he could still do it. But then, his hands moved, the notes flowing from his fingertips like they always had. Grace watched in awe as he played, her heart swelling with pride. She had never seen her father like this, so focused, so alive. When he finished the passage, he looked over at her, his deep-set blue eyes reflecting a mixture of emotions: joy, pain, hope. "Now you try," he said, stepping aside to let her take the lead. Grace's fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly as she tried to mimic what he had shown her. Her first attempt was clumsy, but Michael didn't seem to mind. He patiently guided her through the notes, offering gentle corrections where needed. And for the first time in a long time, the silence between them felt less like a barrier and more like a bridge. As they played together, something shifted. The distance that had once separated them began to close, the music weaving them together in ways words never could. It wasn't perfect, there were still moments of awkwardness, of hesitation, but it was real. And for both of them, that was enough. Later that evening, after Grace had gone to bed, Michael sat at the piano alone. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. He placed his hands on the keys, his heart pounding in his chest as he played a few tentative notes. The silence was still there, ever present, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt hopeful. As he played, Michael realized that the music wasn't gone. It had been waiting for him, quietly, patiently, in the background of his life. And now, through Grace, he was beginning to find his way back to it. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, Michael allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward together, through the silence, towards something new. The days had started to blend together, filled with the quiet rhythms of music lessons, soft conversations, and shared moments at the piano. For the first time in a long time, there was something resembling normalcy in Michael and Grace's home. Their bond, fragile at first, had begun to strengthen, and with each lesson, they grew a little closer. Michael had noticed a change in Grace over the past few weeks. She had always been enthusiastic about playing the piano, but now there was a new intensity in her practice sessions. She seemed driven, almost desperate to improve, to perfect every piece. It was subtle, but Michael could sense it, an urgency in the way her fingers moved over the keys, in the way she asked him for help. At first, he thought it was simply her love for the music, her desire to please him. But now, he wasn't so sure. One afternoon, as they sat at the piano together, Grace stumbled over a particularly difficult section of a piece. Her hands faltered, missing several notes in a row. She sighed in frustration, her fingers hovering above the keys as she tried to figure out what had gone wrong. "Let's try that part again," Michael suggested, his voice calm and reassuring. Grace nodded, but her fingers didn't move. She stared at the sheet music in front of her, her brow furrowed in concentration, but her hands remained still. Michael watched her closely, a sense of unease creeping over him. "Something wasn't right. Grace," he said gently, "is everything okay?" Grace bit her lip, her eyes flicking toward him for just a moment before returning to the keys. She nodded again, but there was something in her expression that made Michael's heart tighten. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, turning her toward him. "Talk to me," he said softly. "What's going on?" For a moment, Grace was silent, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Then, slowly, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a sadness he hadn't seen before. I'm having trouble hearing the notes," she whispered. Michael felt the ground shift beneath him. The words hit him like a punch to the chest, knocking the air out of his lungs. He stared at Grace, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what she had just said. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "It started a while ago," she said quietly. "I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want to upset you." Michael's heart ached as he watched his daughter struggle with the words. He knew this fear, this dread of losing the thing you love most in the world. It was the same fear that had consumed him all those years ago, when the music had gone silent for him. And now, here it was again, threatening to take away the one thing that had brought them together. "How long have you been having trouble?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Grace shrugged, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "A few months, I think. It's not all the time, just sometimes. The notes sound wrong, or I can't hear them at all." Michael closed his eyes, his mind swirling with a mix of emotions, anger, fear, grief. He had always known this was a possibility. The doctors had warned him that his hearing loss could be genetic, that there was a chance Grace could inherit it. But he had never truly believed it would happen, not to her. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Grace looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "I didn't want to make you sad," she whispered. "I didn't want to remind you of what happened to you." Michael's chest tightened, and he reached out, pulling Grace into his arms. She buried her face in his shoulder, her small frame trembling as she cried. He held her tightly, his heart breaking for her, for both of them. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice cracking. "We'll figure this out together." You are not alone, Grace.
I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. For a long time, they stayed like that, wrapped in each other's arms, the weight of the unspoken truth settling between them. When Grace finally pulled back, her eyes were red and swollen, but there was a new resolve in her expression.
What do we do now? She asked, her voice trembling slightly.
Michael took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had spent so long running from the silence, from the pain of his own loss, but now he realized that he couldn't do that anymore.
Not with Grace. She needed him to be strong, to help her face whatever was coming. We'll talk to a doctor, he said, his voice steady. We'll find out what's going on, and we'll figure out how to deal with it.
Together, Grace nodded, her eyes filled with trust. Okay, she whispered. Over the next few days, Michael made appointments with specialists, hoping to get answers about Grace's hearing. It was a long, exhausting process, filled with tests and consultations, but through it all, Michael stayed by her side. He had once felt powerless in the face of his own hearing loss, but now, with Grace, he refused to let that feeling take over.
In the evenings, after their doctor visits, they still sat at the piano together.
Grace's playing was more hesitant now, her confidence shaken by the uncertainty of her condition.
But Michael refused to let her give up.
He encouraged her to keep playing, to keep pushing through the fear.
And slowly, something began to shift.
As they played, they discovered a new way to experience the music, not through sound, but through the vibrations of the piano, through the emotions the music stirred within them. Michael would place his hand on the piano, feeling the notes through his fingertips, and Grace would watch him, sensing the connection they shared through the silent language of music. It wasn't the same as before, but it was something.
It was enough.
One evening, as they sat together at the piano, Grace looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet determination.
We're going to be okay, aren't we?
She asked. Michael smiled, his heart swelling with pride.
Yes, he said softly. We're going to be just fine.
Weeks passed, and the tension that had initially clouded Michael and Grace's home began to dissipate. They had fallen into a routine, one that centered around their quiet moments at the piano and the long, thoughtful conversations they shared afterward. Michael had thrown himself into supporting Grace through her hearing loss. They had spoken to specialists, tested options, and explored new ways to experience the music that meant so much to both of them. Michael had learned something along the way. Grace was stronger than he had ever realized. She didn't shy away from the challenges of her condition, and in many ways, she had become the one leading their journey forward. She was determined not to let the hearing loss define her, and every day, Michael watched as she faced her fears head-on. One evening, after a particularly intense practice session, Grace suggested something that took Michael by surprise.
Dad, she began, her fingers resting lightly on the piano keys. What if we shared this with other people? I mean, I know you're not performing anymore, but there are so many people like us, people who love music, but can't experience it the way they used to. Michael blinked, taken aback by the suggestion. He hadn't considered returning to music in any public sense. The idea of performing again, of putting himself out there, had seemed impossible after the accident.
But Grace's words stirred something inside him. Share it with other people.
He repeated, unsure where she was going.
Grace nodded, her eyes lighting up. Yeah, like?
Maybe there's a way to help others who are deaf or losing their hearing. We could show them that music isn't just about sound, it's about feeling, about emotion. You taught me that, Dad. You helped me realize that I can still love music, even if I can't hear every note.
Michael sat back on the piano bench, letting her words sink in. For so long, he had kept his love for music locked away, afraid of the pain it brought him. But now, through Grace, he was beginning to see it differently.
Music wasn't just something he had lost, it was something that could be reimagined, transformed into something new.
And maybe, just maybe, it could be shared in a way that would help others. "Are you sure?"
he asked, his voice quiet.
"This won't be easy. It's
different from what we're used to."
Grace smiled softly.
"I know it's different, but that doesn't mean it's bad. We've found a new way to connect with music, and maybe we can help others find that too."
The idea stuck with Michael long after they had finished practicing for the night. He lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the possibility of creating something new, something that could bring people together in the way music had once brought him and Grace together. The next day, Michael made a phone call he hadn't expected to make.
He reached out to an old colleague, a composer he had worked with before the accident, someone who had once been a close friend.
The conversation was brief, but by the time it was over, Michael had agreed to collaborate on a new project, a performance designed for the deaf and hard of hearing, one that would use vibrations, lights, and visual elements to convey the emotion of the music. When he told Grace about the project, her eyes lit up with excitement.
"That's amazing, Dad.
This is exactly what we need to do." Michael smiled, her enthusiasm infectious.
"I don't know how it's going to work yet," he admitted,
"But I think
we can figure it out." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Michael and Grace spent hours working together, brainstorming ideas for the performance.
They experimented with different ways to translate the music into something that could be felt rather than heard. Michael had always known that music was more than just sound, it was vibration, emotion, a physical experience.
Now, he and Grace were determined to bring that idea to life in a way that others could understand and feel too.
As the date of the performance approached, Michael felt a mix of excitement and nerves. It had been years since he had stood in front of an audience, and though this performance would be different from anything he had done before, the familiar rush of anticipation was there. But this time, it wasn't just about him, it was about Grace, about the new way they had found to experience the music they both loved. The day of the performance arrived, and the concert hall was filled with people, many of whom had never attended a traditional concert before.
Some were deaf, some hard of hearing, and others were simply curious to see what this new kind of performance would be like. Michael and Grace stood backstage, the hum of anticipation filling the air.
Grace looked up at her father, her eyes filled with a mix of excitement and nervousness. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper.
Michael smiled down at her, feeling a swell of pride.
"I'm ready," he said.
"We're going to do this together." As they stepped onto the stage, the audience fell silent, waiting for something they had never experienced before.
Michael sat down at the piano, placing his hands on the keys. He couldn't hear the notes, but he could feel the vibrations, the familiar hum of the music pulsing through the piano and into his body. Beside him, Grace closed her eyes, her hands resting gently on the piano's edge. She wasn't playing, but she was there, feeling the music in a way only she and her father could understand. And then the lights dimmed, and the performance began. For the next hour, the concert hall was filled with something more than music. It was filled with emotion, with the power of connection that transcended sound. The audience didn't need to hear the notes to understand what was happening on stage. They could feel it, see it, experience it in a way that went beyond the limitations of the human ear. When the final note faded, the audience erupted into applause not for the music they had heard, but for the connection they had felt.
Michael and Grace stood together on the stage, their hearts full, knowing that they had created something new, something meaningful. As they left the stage, Michael realized something that had been quietly growing inside him for a long time. Music wasn't about sound, after all.
It was about feeling. It was about love. And in that moment, standing beside his daughter, he knew that they had found a way to share that with the world.
Reverberation now the persistence of a sound after it is produced, especially in an enclosed space.
Explanation. It refers to the echo or vibration that continues after the original sound has stopped. Example. Michael could feel the reverberations of the piano through the floor, even though he couldn't hear it.
Resignation now the acceptance of something undesirable but inevitable.
Explanation. A feeling of giving up or accepting something that you cannot change. Example. Michael felt a sense of resignation as he acknowledged the distance between him and his daughter.
Thought a verb to lose strength or momentum, to hesitate.
Explanation. When someone starts to weaken or lose confidence, often seen in speech or movement. Example. Grace's fingers faltered on the piano keys when she noticed her father watching her. Estranged ADJ. No longer close or affectionate to someone. Alienated. Explanation. Describes a relationship where the people involved have grown distant emotionally. Example. The accident had left Michael estranged from his music and his family. Tentative ADJ. Not certain or fixed.
Hesitant.
Explanation. Showing caution or uncertainty. Example. Michael took a tentative step toward the piano, unsure if he could face the music again.
Rekindle verb to revive or renew something that has been lost or forgotten.
Explanation. To bring back feelings or interests that had faded away. Example. Grace's love for music helped to rekindle her father's passion for playing.
Subdued ADJ. Quiet, controlled, or restrained in manner.
Explanation. Describes something that is soft or toned down, either in sound or expression. Example. Their conversations were subdued, filled with unspoken words and emotions.
Resonance now the quality of a sound being deep, full, and reverberating.
Explanation refers to the richness and depth of a sound, or metaphorically, an idea that strongly affects someone. Example. Though he couldn't hear, Michael felt the resonance of the piano in his soul. Thank you so much for watching the story today. Did you enjoy Michael and Grace's journey, and were you able to understand everything clearly? Was it easy to follow along?
Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
If you'd like to keep improving your English skills, there are more stories just like this one waiting for you on the channel.
Stick around and watch another. I'll have a suggestion for you at the end of this video.
It's a great way to expand your vocabulary and enjoy more heartwarming tales. You're doing great, and I'm so happy to have you here with me. See you in the next story.